This is All India Radio. Please stand by for the next program.
This is All India Radio. You will now hear comments from the press. The Hindu in its editorial titled Iran on the Boil says nationwide protests that broke out over the weekend are the latest challenge to the Iranian regime that's already struggling to fix a battered economy, hostile ties with the US and waning influence in West Asia. The trigger was the government's decision to raise the price of rationed fuel. Thousands of people took to the streets, reminiscent of recent protests in Hong Kong, Chile, Lebanon and neighboring Iraq. The protesters chanted slogans against the Islamic regime, carried "Death to Khomeini" posters in a direct challenge to the country's supreme leader Ali Khamenei and burned down banks and stores. Security personnel reportedly unleashed violence on the protesters while the government shut down the internet. According to Iranian media, at least 12 people were killed, including security personnel, and some 1,000 protesters were arrested. Both President Hassan Rouhani and Ayatollah Khamenei, the real ruler of Iran, have condemned the protest, while the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the country's top military force, has threatened to crack down on the demonstrations, raising the prospects of more violence. Iran still has one of the lowest fuel prices in the world, but the rise was enough for a people reeling under high inflation, joblessness and a collapsing economy to take to the street. President Donald Trump's decision last year to pull the US out of the 2015 nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions has dealt a blow to Iran's economy. Inflation has risen to 40%. A quarter of Iran's youth are unemployed, and according to the IMF, the country's economy is expected to contract by 9.5% this year, while the rial has plunged to a record low against the dollar. It is now evident that the collapse of the nuclear deal has cost the Iranian economy dearly. The Statesman, in its editorial titled The Bolivia Tragedy, says, with the outgoing president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, taking the fight out from La Paz to Mexico, his asylum in another swath of Latin American signals the end of a chapter and the beginning of another in the Bolivian narrative. To be fair, Morales was a successful leader, a trade unionist with familial roots among the country's indigenous peoples. He was first elected president in 2005 and was twice returned to office with substantial majorities. He is credited by the IMF with achieving a drastic reduction in poverty among farmers and cocoa growers, notably a societal revolution that transformed the condition of the country's numerous ethnic minority groups. After weeks of street protest, political defections, a police mutiny, and a critical decision by the army to withdraw its support, Morales voluntarily quit last Sunday and fled into exile into Mexico. Bolivia now stutters in search of its moorings. Morales has reportedly said he quit the country because he feared for his life and now claims he was the victim of a coup and his resignation was not formalized. He has also described the properly constituted interim government of Jeanine Áñez as a dictatorship. This recalcitrance runs the risk of stoking yet more violence between the supporters and security forces that claimed 5 more lives last Friday. The Indian Express, in its editorial titled Defection and Dissent, says last week the Supreme Court upheld the disqualification of 17 Karnataka legislators by then Speaker K.R. Ramesh, but permitted them to contest the by-polls which are round the corner. This is the second political case that landed before the Supreme Court following the uncertain mandate in the 2018 Karnataka Assembly polls. The court validated the Speaker's decision to disqualify the MLAs. However, it set aside the Speaker's order barring the disqualified MLAs from contesting elections for the remainder of the Assembly term. At first glance, the decision appears to be a balancing act, allowing a win for both sides. However, the verdict by a 3-judge bench headed by Justice N.V. Ramanna stays with the letter of the law. The Representation of the Peoples Act 1951 and the 10th schedule of the Constitution, which deals with anti-defection, do not give the Speaker the power to indicate the period for which a person is disqualified. On the other hand, Article 164(1)(b), which deals with the consequences of disqualification of an MLA, states that an MLA disqualified under the 10th schedule is also disqualified from being a minister for duration of the period commencing from the date his disqualification till the date on which the term of his office as such member would expire, or where he contests any election to the Legislative Assembly of a state or either house of the legislature or a state having legislative council, as the case may be, before the expiry of such period, till the date on which he is declared elected, whichever is earlier. By implication, this provision permits an MLA disqualified under the 10th schedule to be re-elected to the House. Those were the comments in the press presented to you by the News Services Division of All India Radio.
This broadcast came to you from